But without the state, who would fund science? Ask anyone whether they think the state should fund scientific research. There is an extremely high chance, almost 100%, that they will say yes. Nowadays, this is taken for granted. It is a topic that is hardly even discussed. There is an almost unanimous position that scientific progress fundamentally depends on state funding. Funding agencies, public universities, research institutes, scholarships, this entire state arsenal, sustained by money stolen from the productive sector, occupies a central place in the debate about science. For almost everyone without the state, science simply cannot exist. However, if we analyze this issue more deeply, we will see that this belief is historically, ethically, and economically problematic. The most frequent argument in favor of state funding is that science would be a public good. Thus, since knowledge can be disseminated and enjoyed by many, the NPCs of the world argue that the market would not have sufficient incentives to finance scientific research. Therefore, it should be up to the nanny state to correct this alleged failure. But is that so? Such reasoning, although seductive to the unwary, ignores the central fact that the state is incapable of creating resources. On the contrary, everything the state invests in science was previously taken coercively from individuals, families, and companies through direct or indirect taxes. Every penny allocated to a scholarship, a project, or a laboratory is a penny that is no longer used for other, more urgent demands of society. Moreover, this concept of science as a public, common good is exaggerated. Many scientific advances generate clear private returns through competitive advantages, cost reductions, or opening of new markets. Companies invest in research not out of altruism, but because they see future value. And they would do so much more if not for state distortions. Even the so-called basic science, presented as completely disconnected from practical applications, is often funded by indirect expectations of return, reputation, technological leadership, or later exploitation of discoveries. The market, far from being short-sighted, has a rich history of financing risky scientific projects when it believes that the potential gains compensate for the risks, and it does so by allocating resources ethically and rationally. When the state takes on the role of funding science, however, there is the basic problem that it does so in an unethical manner, since it coercively extracts, via the threat of fines, imprisonment, or death, resources from the productive sector. There is also the issue of irrational resource allocation. The state does not have the correct incentives. It does not operate with profits and losses. It does not respond directly to consumer preferences, and it does not suffer personal losses when it makes mistakes. Thus, decisions about which areas to fund, which projects to approve, which students to reward with scholarships, and which researchers to privilege are inevitably influenced by political criteria, academic fads, corporate pressures, and ideological agendas. There is no way around this problem. It is a logical consequence of centralized decision-making. In many Western countries, this distortion is quite evident. The system of scientific funding is highly bureaucratized, slow, and formalistic. Researchers spend a considerable portion of their time filling out forms, justifications, and reports, far more concerned with meeting countless administrative requirements than with producing relevant knowledge. The incentive structure rewards conformity, not originality. Projects that fit the dominant discourse, the ideological agenda, or the political priorities of the moment have a much greater chance of approval than ideas that are truly innovative and disruptive. For example, in my area of research, ecology, we knew that if we included in the project something related to the so-called climate change, the chances of approval increased greatly. There is also the problem of institutional inertia. Once a program, institute, or line of research funded by the state is created, it becomes extremely difficult to shut it down, even when its results are mediocre or irrelevant. Public funding creates academic fiefdoms in which, sheltered from competition, survival depends far more on maintaining the flow of resources than on the quality of the scientific output. Instead of a dynamic environment in which ideas compete and are constantly tested, a rigid system forms risk-averse and immune to criticism. Another frequently ignored effect is the decrease of private funding. When the state becomes the main sponsor of science, companies, investors, and philanthropists reduce their own involvement. This phenomenon is called crowding out. That is, the state is not merely complementing the market, it is replacing it. After all, why would anyone take high risks with their own resources if the state is already footing much of the bill for research? The result of this crowding out phenomenon is a science, if we can even call it science, that is increasingly dependent on public funds and increasingly disconnected from the true needs of society. And in many countries, this dependence is aggravated by an environment hostile to private initiative. What we know so well: high tax burdens, excessive bureaucracy, expensive credit, and legal insecurity, which discourage long-term investments, including those in research and scientific development. Faced with this scenario, state funding comes to seem like the only possible alternative. However, this reverses cause and effect. It is not the absence of the state that prevents the flourishing of private science, but rather the excess of state intervention that suffocates entrepreneurship, innovation, and capital accumulation, which are necessary to sustain scientific research. Furthermore, there is an ethical aspect that is rarely discussed. Funding science with public resources means forcing people who may never benefit from a given project, or who may disagree with its objectives, to pay for it. This is especially problematic in a country with deep social inequalities, where millions of people struggle to meet basic needs. Nothing new. It is the state transferring wealth from the poorest to the richest. None of this implies that science would cease to exist without the state. On the contrary, a science free from state funding would tend to become far more diverse, competitive, and connected to society. Private universities, entrepreneurs, associations, foundations, investors, or even innovative models of crowdfunding would assume central roles. Researchers would be encouraged to demonstrate the value of their ideas not to bureaucrats, but to voluntary funders willing to take risks in exchange for possible scientific, technological, or social returns. History shows us that great scientific advances occurred long before the existence of state funding agencies. The institutionalization of science by the state is a recent phenomenon and not a necessary condition for the progress of knowledge. Defending the state model or the private model of scientific funding is not merely a technical position. It is also an ethical choice about how scarce resources should be used and who should decide about this. Those who defend the state model defend aggression and coercion against peaceful individuals in the name of an alleged common good. In addition to being unethical, this state funding of science compromises the intellectual independence of researchers, creating incentives for conformity and self-censorship. A private model would be better, yielding a science that would be far freer, more responsible, and more aligned with people's voluntary choices. Thus, freeing science from state tutelage is precisely the necessary step for it to flourish in a more authentic, productive, and socially relevant way.